The railway line was always down whenever they traveled. It just seemed to happen. Disruptions that required them to wait for hours on end for the service to resume. Or, if they were lucky, until bus service took the place of dilapidated trains. Today was no different. They sat together near the back of the bus as it trudged along through the night. She laid her head on him, tired and annoyed at the incessant misfortune they always had when traveling. He stared out the window, daydreaming. His thoughts fluttered and passed, none sufficient enough to harbor for more than a few moments. The dim lights in the cabin caused his reflection to stare back at him. There were many people on the bus, considering it was so late, but that's to be expected when the train is having problems. For so many people being on the bus, it was oddly silent. John chalked it up to the late hour and continued to stare vacantly out the window. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see something speed past the bus. It caused him to jolt out of his semi-conscious state. He looked around the bus, at the other passengers. No one had seen or noticed anything. It was dark outside. Maybe he had dozed off and dreamt it. As they drove through Winchester, he noticed how the fog gathered around the old lamppost were eerily similar to those you would imagine when Jack the Ripper walked the streets of Whitechapel. Would he be lucky enough to catch a glimpse of an ominous figure skulking in the fog? One could always hope. He glanced over at his travel companion. He smiled at her as she slept. She shifted in her sleep, and he slouched slightly, so she could position her head better on his shoulder. His eyes returned to the window and met the gaze of something. Something that was moving on par with the bus and was now looking into the vehicle. Shocked, he straightened up, causing Delilah to wake. She looked up at him in a daze, and he told her what he saw. They both turned to the now empty window. He was sure he'd seen something, and something had seen him. He sat there confused. He looked out at where they were, hoping to see the name of a town they were passing through, but all that was out the window now was a thick mass of trees. The bus began to slow down. He could see the other passengers look around in confusion. John looked towards the front of the bus to try to see why they were stopping. Outside, the night was still and dark. Very dark. So dark it felt like the dark was advancing on the bus. A tree had fallen across the road, and considering they were driving through a woodland, it was hardly a shock. The bus driver turned the lights on in the cabin, and the loudspeaker began to crackle.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry to inform you, but unfortunately our trip has been delayed due to a tree obstructing our path. Woodland Services have been contacted, and we can expect to be moving within the next hour or so. Your patience is appreciated. Thank you.
The loudspeaker went dead again. Murmurs rose throughout the bus as people grew agitated. A few individuals stood up and started protesting. "You haven't even gone out to look. What if we could move the tree enough to go around it? You didn't even try." The bus driver was going to go out for a smoke anyways, so he let the passengers know he was going out to assess the situation. John laid his head on the window again and closed his eyes, but not a moment later was awoken by the sound of terrified screams. "Something took the bus driver!" John looked over at Delilah. "What's going on?" She was pale, clearly upset by what was going on. Before she could answer, there was a loud thud. The bus driver, or what was left of him, was thrown on top of the bus and fell off. Nobody knew what happened. A few people claimed they saw the bus driver snatched up into the trees, and now he was dead. His body lay dissected and spread over the ground outside the bus. One brave gentleman, a nurse named Gary, rushed off the bus to help the driver, but returned immediately, pushing the button to close the doors behind him. He sat on the floor by his seat, shaking violently. The other passengers crowded him and asked what he'd seen, but he simply sat there shaking. A loud crack could be heard, and the bus shook. Whatever killed the bus driver was on top of the bus. Nobody moved. Delilah gripped John's shirt and cried. He held her. For a while, nothing more happened. Whatever it was had stopped walking on the bus. The passengers began to discuss what to do. The consensus reached was, it must have been a wolf, or a bear, maybe both. But whatever it was, they were almost certain it had left them now. The man who first stepped off the bus, Gary, finally stood up. "It's not a wolf," he said, "and it's not a bear." The crowd quieted down and gave him their joint attention. "Whatever the hell it isn't anything anyone has ever seen," he told them. It knew what it was doing while it ate him. I saw it in its eyes. It's waiting and watching us. It has a plan. Panic set in as the people did not know what to do. Some wanted to run to the now dead bus driver and get back the bus keys. But if it was still out there, that would be a death sentence. And to make matters worse, there was no cell reception in these woods. Finally, one passenger suggested they try to radio in the situation to get help. The crowd agreed with him, and he walked tentatively towards the driver's seat. He cautiously sat in the driver's seat, picked up the radio that sat on the dashboard, and pushed the button. Before he could say any words, he was ripped through the window. He could be heard, screaming on top of the bus as he was being torn apart. As he screamed, pieces of him were seen being thrown off the top of the bus. One of his hands, an arm, and a foot, before the screaming finally stopped. They were all going to die if Woodland Services didn't arrive quickly enough. John was sure of that. He and Delilah moved to the center of the bus, as far from the windows as possible. Within moments, all the passengers did the same. They sat tightly huddled together, all quietly hoping being in a group would protect them. With the speed and ferocity it moved with, nothing could protect them. It could run through the bus right now if it wanted, and all they could hope for was a quick death. John continued to hold Delilah as she quietly cried. He didn't counsel her or tell her everything would be okay, but he did tell her they wanted to be as quiet as possible. The bus driver said Woodland Services could be there as quickly as within the hour. They only needed to wait. The bus's headlights illuminated the bodies outside the bus, putting this creature's work on full display. This, along with all the other lights and electronics left on in the bus without the engine running, was draining the battery. The lights dimmed and flickered. John looked out the window one last time before the lights completely gave up. They sat now, in darkness. The passengers were huddled together so closely, John could feel the vibrations of people shaking. As terrifying as this had been, the darkness managed to increase the fear. The bus shook, as whatever it was walked across the bus's roof. Special thanks to our top Patreons for making this episode possible, especially the uber-patient John Winter. If you enjoyed this Creepypasta video and want to see more, I recommend The Outsider. Click here. If you want to see some true scary stories from the woods sent in by subscribers, click here.